With that, it looks like we are just past 10 o'clock, so we might as well go ahead and get things started. I'll say a big welcome to our first virtual BREC meeting. This one today is going to be all around back to work, the when, whether, where, how to reopen. I'm Jessica Payne. I'm this year's BREC chairwoman. BREC is the Birmingham Regional Enterprise Council, for those of you who may be new to it. I'm excited to have you join us today. I'm a commercial banker at JP Chase, normally here in Birmingham, but today coming to you from my living room in Trussville. So I know a lot of you are just like me, sitting in your living rooms or in your home offices and trying to figure out if you are the one responsible for making decisions about coming back to work, if it's time, or bringing back that information to your company. I don't know. We were discussing some of the background interruptions that happened. I know yesterday I had a meeting that my two tiny coworkers were in the background, princess dresses and ninja masks, racing hobby horses. So it reaffirmed to me that I am ready to come back to work, as I know several of you might be as well. But that'll also just keep everybody on your toes. Because like we said, you never know what might pop up in the background. So it'll keep things interesting. But so just thank you for joining us today. We are going to hear from Fred McCallum at the BBA and Janell Ahnert, who's a shareholder with Littler. We'll be talking a little bit about some of the different feedback that Fred has gotten from BBA investors, a little bit of around the new mask ordinance, some of the changes to that, some information on that front, and then some of the resources that the BBA has that can help along those lines as well. And then Janell's going to talk more. She's got some great content around some of the logistics, some of the legal issues to be thinking about as you're contemplating coming back to work. So just as you, I basically as a little housekeeping, after the presentation, if you want to go to the BBA website, they have a COVID-19 resource page that Fred will tell you a little bit more about, but there's a webinars link there, and that will give you all the slides from today's presentation, and then other webinars that have been hosted by the BBA in the past as well. We'll hope to have some time for questions, and either way, if we do have time or if we don't, we'll post some of those responses on those links as well. So you can go ahead and check those out afterwards if you want. And then otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Fred. Fred, you may know, has been, had a 30-year career with AT&T Alabama, Bell South, South Central Bell before that. The last 9 years of that, he was the president of AT&T in Alabama. He's been a very active member in the community in Birmingham. He has served as chair of the BBA in the past. The BCA has helped with United Way work, the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and Blind, PARCA, Birmingham Ed Foundation. He's been very involved all around town in some great organizations, but the role that we're most thankful for right now is his role as interim president and CEO at the BBA. It's unprecedented times, and we are really proud and glad to have Fred with his sleeves rolled up, helping us through so many of these issues. So with that, Fred, I will hand it over to you to help us sort it out and give us all the wisdom and guidance you've got for us.
Thank you, Jessica. Don't get your hopes up too high here. Thank you, Jessica. Welcome, everyone. First of all, Jessica, I want to thank you for your leadership of the BREC and all that you've done, and for the support of JP Chase as well. We at the BBA, we're continuing our focus on our mission, which has been and will continue to be to lead the regional growth strategy and deliver services to our businesses and to our partners that create high quality jobs and move us toward a resilient economy. We have been, over the last 8 weeks, our organizational lives have been changed significantly, as I'm sure most of yours have. I'm speaking to you now from the middle of what is still pretty much a desolate downtown Birmingham area, right at the corner of 5th Avenue North and 20th Street. And there's still not a lot of folks down here, obviously. We've been focused most recently on two things. First, we've been focused on bringing accurate, up-to-date information to businesses throughout our region. And we've really tried to focus in on getting information out there that's from trusted sources, making sure that we keep it up to date as we go throughout time. There's a lot of changes in what we're all dealing with every day. We all know that, and all the local plans and stuff. But we keep that on our website. As Jessica said, it's birminghambusinessalliance.com. If you go there, you will see pretty quickly a link to go to the COVID-19 resource site. So please go there if you need information on anything. And if you need to ask a question, there's an ask a question feature on there. And we mean that to be, if you need to ask a question about anything, feel free to ask that and we will respond to you rapidly. Second, we've been focused on helping businesses weather their way through this pandemic, especially focused on small and mid-tier companies in our region. We've been able to reach out to over 550 companies during the last 8 weeks to provide assistance. We started really probably dealing more with the loan, PPP loan process, EIDL loan process, and assisting businesses with those applications and the process that they needed to go through. Over the last week to 10 days, we have kind of pivoted our focus onto returning to work, reopening our workplaces, and bringing information to businesses about what they should be looking at and what they should be considering in that time period. Businesses really have two questions I hear. First question is, when do I have the ability to make my own decision to open my business, which is largely controlled by the state or the county. And then the second and probably more important question is, what requirements should I follow in order to open my business safely? And so you're going to hear today a lot of great information on that second question. I've been able to preview some of the information you're going to hear, and I'm going to tell you it's really going to be helpful. I want to thank Janell Ahnert at Little Law Firm for being with us. I want to thank all of our investors that are on this call for your support of the BBA. Whenever you get in trying times like this, is whenever you really tend to focus on that support and how helpful it is to us in order to achieve our mission and to help the business community grow in our region. So thank you very much for attending today. And with that, I will turn it back to Jessica.
And I will be introducing Janell. Janell Ahnert is a shareholder at Littler Mendelsohn, and she is the past BREC chair as well. She has a lot more experience in this chair than I do, for sure, and she's brought some great resources today. Her law practice primarily focuses on employment law, specifically representing management in both employment counseling and employment litigation. Over the past couple months, she's been very involved with writing several different articles related to COVID-19, the rapidly changing COVID-19 landscape. This is her 5th webinar on giving guidance to businesses working through several of these issues related to COVID-19. So she's got some great information that she'll be able to share. And I'm not going to take any more time with an intro because I know I've seen these slides and she's got a lot of great stuff. You'll want to be taking notes. So Janell, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jessica, and thank you, Fred. I'm so pleased to be here, not only with Birmingham Business Alliance, but also with BREC. BREC has a special place in my heart. I worked with y'all for 2 years and love the group and love those who are part of it. Those of you who are on the webinar, if you're not currently involved as a BBA investor or as a part of BREC, which is the Birmingham Regional Enterprise Council, that's really focused on small businesses. If that works for your business model, please reach out and be involved. There are so many great resources. I know I continue to rely on BBA for almost daily updates right now on COVID-19 information. And so I just can't stress enough what a great network it is just to get you the resources that you need right now. So happy to be here. We're going to get started. As Fred said, this is my disclaimer slide. We've got a lot to talk about, and we're going to be moving fast. And so, again, this will be available, the slides to you later, so don't feel like you've got to write everything down. But if you've got questions, we're going to try to get to questions at the end. And an important thing for you to know is we don't know everything today, and what we know today keeps changing. One example, I was tweaking a slide last night because the EOC changed some guidance within 24 hours. They had issued guidance for employers on one thing, and then they took it back the next day. And so what we're telling you today, unfortunately, may change in the future, but this is helping businesses do the next best thing with the information we have now and the guidance we have from the EOC, from the CDC, from OSHA, from the Department of Labor. We've spent a lot of time in the last few months looking at guidance and making our best decisions based on the information we have right now. So always helpful to remember this is a changing environment, rapidly changing. And as always, this is a webinar for information. Make sure you are following up with your own attorneys with regards to true legal counsel on these issues. So what we're going to talk about today are 6 different areas. We kind of skip to the how to reopen and don't always talk through whether and when. And so we're going to talk through that a little bit at first, then go through how you go about calling your employees back if you've been shut down during this time, if they've been furloughed, or if you had to lay them off permanently. Then what to do with exposure situations in your workplace. Those of you who have not been open during this time, that's going to be a new experience for you. We've had a lot of manufacturers, a lot of essential workers who have been already dealing with this, and employers dealing with this, who stayed open, but it'll be new if you have not had those policies in place. Then maintaining a safe workplace, making sure that you've got all the protocols in place before you return employees to your workplace. Then a little bit on PPP. I'm not your PPP expert. As Fred said, there's been a lot of great content from BBA about PPP loans, but just want to make sure you've got that on your radar so that you're asking the right questions of the PPP experts as you're returning people to work. And then some talk about contingency planning. Stick with us to the end. We're going to have questions, and then we're going to also have a giveaway. Our firm has put together a ton of different toolkits for employers. So instead of having to pay by the hour, they can purchase a toolkit that's got guidance and it's got policies and it's got forms that they can use. We're going to give away a couple of the return to work toolkits that Littler has put together at the end of the webinar. So stick with us for that. And for questions, you could have submitted them at the beginning, but you also will open up the chat as we get towards the end to take more of your questions. So first and foremost, putting things in sequence. Before we talk about how to open, we need to really decide whether and when. And as Fred said, some of that is whether and when you have the ability to make the decision to reopen. Currently, under the Safer at Home order that we're under, only certain businesses can reopen. We have moved into, instead of a shelter at home, into a safer at home. And so we're moving forward under the state order. But there still are limitations that you don't have the decision yet to make whether or not you can reopen. When the state order says that your business can reopen, you then have got to go through and make the decision when and whether it's going to be right for you to reopen. Just because the state lifts the restriction and says you can doesn't mean you're ready to reopen, doesn't mean you're ready to bring employers back or to bring customers back. So the first practical suggestion we've got is, in thinking through this, you've got to really address it with a multidisciplinary team. This is easier for large employers. Look at all these groups on here that are really who you need to be coordinating with. Smaller organizations, smaller businesses, like the ones that are often a part of BREC, you don't always have these separate departments. One person may be playing the role of 3, 4, all of these areas. So you want to make sure whoever is working for your company in addressing these type of issues is involved in the team who is making the decision of when to reopen. And then that team will also work together to talk about how to reopen. So sales and marketing, you know, are you going to have sufficient customers to support 100% reopening? You know, just because you open up your doors doesn't mean that people are ready to shop with you or ready to have your non-essential medical, you know, whatever if you're a dentist, then maybe they're not ready to come back and have their teeth cleaned. And so if you're not going to have the same customer client flow, you know, what percentage do you need in order to be able to recall employees and to be able to support all of the costs of reopening? And so thinking through that with sales and marketing people, your facilities group, who's working on the logistics of your building. Are you going to have sufficient cleaning supplies, disinfectant? Those have been hard to come by of late. And so will there be toilet paper? Will there be paper towels? Will you be able to get personal protective equipment, or what we've been calling PPE? That's one of the acronyms that everyone knows what PPE means now, and in the past only employment lawyers knew what that meant with regard to, and people who worked in factories. So are you going to have that personal protective equipment available? Can you get it when you order it? Will it come in time? All those things. Where do desks need to be positioned? Do you need different types of plastic sheeting to keep people apart? All those things need to be thought through. Can you get that equipment in time? And if you can't, then you're going to have to delay when you open back up. Real estate, do we have space to provide social distancing? Can we bring everybody back at once, or do we have to, you know, bring smaller groups back at a time, because not everyone, we don't have the room to bring our entire workforce back and keep everyone 6 feet apart. How are we going to communicate through public relations in the event of an exposure? How are we going to communicate internally with our employees? Working with your lawyers, you know, what do the, number one, we've got to make sure we're abiding by the ordinances that are in place, abiding by any cities ordinances, any county orders, any state orders, making sure that we are in compliance with all of those. So it's a lot to think through. Your in-house employment counsel, or if you use outside counsel like what I do, your HR folks and government relations people who are kind of working with groups who are dealing with these orders, dealing with these ordinances. They have been kind of in the trenches during all this time, and they're going to probably be your leaders for determining whether and when to get back to work. And again, you may not have people in those exact positions, but you probably have resources that you utilize in order to make decisions relating to those areas. So you want to make sure those people are on your team and going through this decision-making process. There are lots of resources out there. These are just some that I pulled from BBA. Rachel was great. Birchfield sent me a bunch of resources that BBA tracks. You've got industry groups. You've got groups in the specific area where you are operating. You've got government groups. And so they're all in conversation right now, talking about how does my specific industry get back to work, and what does that look like? And so you need to engage with those other groups. You're not the only restaurant reopening in Birmingham. You're not the only daycare reopening in Birmingham. Reach out to others in that industry. places like BBA and BREC is where so much of those relationships are built and where so much of that networking takes place. Reach out to BBA if you don't have those resources in place yet. But there are so many industry groups and so many groups in Alabama, business groups that are focused on this and can talk through with you issues that are specific to your area of employment. Reopening a manufacturer looks very different from reopening a restaurant. And so you want to talk through who's doing this, what have they done, what worked, what hasn't worked. There's so many lessons to be learned. Gosh, we've learned so many lessons already, right, over the last 8 weeks, that don't be the test case for everything. There's no reason for that. So many people are thinking through so many things in such a unique and creative way to come up with solutions and problem solving. Be a part of those groups. Search them out, use their knowledge, and implement the things that they're doing. Now, this is just a little background so everybody knows, you know, we've got a guidelines for opening up America again that came down from the White House, and these are kind of the gate areas where we've got to get through these gates in order to go through different phases. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. You can go to that website, Guidelines for Opening Up America again, and go through again. We're looking at symptoms in our community, cases in our community, hospital, what's going on with regard to the numbers in our hospitals in our community to determine at what phase we can be at in our reopening. And phase 1 is for states and regions that have satisfied those gating criteria. We are not quite there yet, and that's, as you know, under our safer at home order that the state has entered, we are not quite at a phase 1 opening. We haven't reopened restaurants, we haven't reopened gyms, we clearly have not reopened hairdressers, as you can see by my appearance. So we are not even all the way to a phase 1 opening yet. A lot of people are already looking towards phase 2, which won't happen and shouldn't happen. We don't know what. If I could predict every order that comes out from Montgomery or from any other capital in the United States right now, I would not be on this webinar with you because I would have already retired a billionaire. And so we don't know where we're going to be on the 15th of May. We don't know what's going to happen next, but what we can do is use the information we have, again, to make the best decisions in preparing for what comes next. So if we're not a phase 1 business, we can't reopen until phase 2. We need to be looking forward to that. If we are a phase 1 business, we need to determine if we are really going to want to open when we go to a complete phase 1. Are we ready for that? Will we have the customer base that we feel like will support all of the expenses that go with reopening a business? So again, this is just all part of that, thinking about the weather and the when. This was on Mayor Woodfin's Instagram yesterday. I don't know if y'all follow him. He's got such great social media presence, and I love seeing everything that he posts. It's always very informative and often very engaging and inspiring. And so I've appreciated his leadership during this time. I've appreciated the responsiveness of the city to a lot of when the city issued the shutdown order and then issued the mask ordinance. They've been very responsive in answering questions, in clarifying and providing updated guidance. And I think that's just been some great Birmingham leadership. And so I certainly have appreciated that. But this was from yesterday on his Instagram. And so again, if we're looking at data, you can be tracking UAB data. That is one thing that Birmingham, we are so lucky to have UAB in our community as a leader during this time and during this crisis. The kind of information that we can get from a local source like UAB is just so helpful and so reliable, and we're lucky. A lot of communities don't have that type of resource. So make sure you're tracking that. Make sure you're taking a look at, are we getting close to any of those gates that we'll be able to move past. And you know, again, this is where we were yesterday, and you know, we'll see on the 15th what decisions made by the governor and you know, and by all of the resources. You know, Dr. Harris has been amazing in his support and in his knowledge. And so as we get closer to that, we'll keep tracking it and we'll keep providing more information. BBA will be, but you need to, as part of your decision-making process, be looking through all that as well. So let's say you've decided you are ready. You're gonna open back up. The governor has said you can, the mayor has said you can, Jefferson County has said you can, and you have, you're ready to do it. You think your customers will be there, and so you're ready to call employees back. We've got to figure out how to do that. Calling employees back, if you're a really small business, is a much easier decision-making process. And of course, it depends on what status your employees were in. Were they in a furlough or temporary layoff status, or were they in a permanent layoff? Did you have to permanently lay them off or let them go? And so are you rehiring employees, or are you calling people back from a temporary layoff? The first thing you want to do in almost every case here is to review any type of handbooks you have, any type of policies. If you are an organized workplace, make sure you follow your collective bargaining agreement with regard to recalls. And so if there is a policy in place for your employer about how people are called back, in what order, is it seniority, is it some other merit-based system, make sure you're following your policies there. One big question we get a lot is, well, can we call back, you know, we're only going to call back a portion of our workforce to start. We don't think we're going to have 100% business back when we open our doors. So we want to start with the people who are low risk. So we want to, you know, start with people who, you know, exposure to COVID is low risk for them. Well, one problem with this is it can lead to an age discrimination case or a pregnancy discrimination case. Again, it's as you're well aware, if you've ever been to any of my webinars or any other employment lawyers webinars, you can't make a decision on behalf of an employee if they have an underlying medical condition. We're not the doctor. We don't get to decide, oh no, that's too risky for you, and take any type of almost a more paternalistic attitude towards an employee and say, I'm not going to let you do that because it's too risky for you. That is up to the employee and up to their doctor. And so we've got to be careful and beware about issues with, we're going to call back our low risk employees first. Those are mostly going to be younger employees. And that could be a real issue. In fact, we've got, the EOC had a webinar late last month that was very helpful. I encourage you to go to the eoc.gov website and pull that up. Excuse me. And one of their questions from the webinar is, can you exclude someone who's 65 years or older, who does not have any symptoms, and you just are afraid they're going to be high risk if they come to work? And the EOC is very clear. The answer to that is no, that can be age discrimination. Now, if an employee comes to you and says, I feel I am high risk, I'm over the age of 65, I don't want to come back to work, that's a completely different discussion, as opposed to you making the decision not to bring someone back because they are in a high-risk age category or because they're pregnant. That's another area that we've seen a lot of discussion about. So how are you going to call them back? Is it going to be by seniority? Is it going to be somehow by merit? We always suggest using some type of objective measurement. If it's merit, you know, it's not just a subjective, that person's a better employee than the other. You've got underlying documentation to establish that, like a written evaluation. You may want to do a disparate impact analysis if you're a really large employer and you want to make sure the decisions you're not making are somehow negatively impacting a group based on race or age or gender or any other protected category. One thing to think about is, who do you need back? Who are the essential employees in what roles? And it's certainly fine to call back certain groups of employees who are performing a certain function, and allowing other people who can continue to telework or continue keeping other people on layoff. So if there's certain functions that you need to happen before you, in different phases of reopening, it's certainly fine to bring in certain groups performing certain functions. That's an objective way of meeting your business needs. So that's one thing to think of first. Who do you call back first? But another thing to think through is, just because you reopen your doors, like we said, you may not have the customers that you want back, but in addition, it doesn't mean your employees are going to report to work. And we're hearing a ton of this from employers who are making plans to reopen, are talking with employers about target dates, and their employees are very concerned about coming back to work and are really pushing back about that. And so you've got to walk through and think through those issues. We've seen a ton of union involvement, even across Alabama, where we've not had as much union involvement in the recent past. We've seen a ton of union leaders and unions responding to issues of the safe workplace and whether or not it's safe for employees to return, and whether or not job sites should reopen. If you are not an organized employer, you could still see some what we call concerted efforts to oppose returning to work. And so just because you're not, don't have a union doesn't mean that your employees cannot engage in activity that's protected by the National Labor Relations Act. So you may see, we're seeing lots of protests right now about open back up, but in other, some areas we may start seeing more and more protests from employees not wanting to return to work, not feeling it's safe, not feeling their employers have taken the right steps necessary before bringing them back to work. So we've got to realize that even if you're not unionized, that concerted activity, just by 2 or more employees talking through those concerns publicly, even protesting, we've got to resist the temptation to discipline those workers, engage with your outside lawyers on that before you plan your next step, because it can still be a violation of the National Labor Relations Act, even though you don't have a union in your shop. So how do we engage with employees when they tell us, I'm not comfortable coming back yet? You've got to have your plan in place, because now's the time when you've got to communicate with your employees about what the plan is going to be. And so it is important to get engaged with them, talk about the safety measures you're taking, talk about what logistics you're putting into place to maintain social distancing, the increased cleaning, increased disinfecting, what you're doing to make sure and reassure them that you are not going to bring them back until you're ready to keep them safe, and that you've done the steps that you've needed to do to make sure that happens. And so a lot of times, and the short answer is, yeah, you can make them come back. You can say, you either come back or I will fire you and someone else will come to work in your place. And you're allowed to do that right now. That's permitted. But the longer answer and the management versus the legal answer is that going to be helpful to just fire someone? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it creates an example and then suddenly everybody else is back at work. Sometimes it makes it much harder. If it's a long-term employee who's done a great job for you, think through all of the resources you're going to have that you've invested in that person, in hiring and training, in coaching and developing. And so just because someone expresses a concern, that's really just the time to engage with them about what you're doing to make sure that the workplace is safe. but they may still request the ability not to come to work. You know, if someone asks you, you know, I really want to keep working from home, I'm not ready to come back yet. You know, that's when you've got to engage with them, you know, about the why of that. And again, if the why is, I think I might get sick, then the response is, you know, well, this is what we're doing to make sure you don't get sick. If the why is, you know, I have an autoimmune deficiency and my doctor says I'm high risk and I shouldn't be working, well, that's going to trigger an ADA interactive process where under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you need to engage with that employee and see if you're able to accommodate them. That interactive process is the one I was talking about where the EOC is not even sure what you can and can't ask during that process. They issued some guidance earlier this week, which kind of opened up the floodgates where you could basically ask about an underlying medical condition and make a decision to keep an employee out of the workplace if they have one of the underlying medical conditions that the CDC has identified as being high risk. And that they've since pulled that back. That guidance is no longer on their website. They have not yet, as of I checked the website last night. It may be different this morning. We'll see when we get off this webinar. But as of last night, they have not engaged in what it was that they felt was misinterpreted and what the new guidance will be. So as you can see, even working with EOC guidance where it's a minute by minute update with regard to what you can and can't do. So our best advice right now is if an employee is saying they cannot come back to work because of a disability, and pregnancy can be a disability if it's high risk. And so just being pregnant is not a disability under the ADA, but if you receive information from an employee's doctor saying, this employee is pregnant and should not be working right now because of the COVID-19 exposure, then you should work to accommodate that employee under the ADA. Again, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't say, I know you're pregnant, I don't think you should work. That's not up to you to decide. But if you do receive and engage with that employee and there are medical issues there, then that would be uncovered under the ADA. So here's the rub. If our employees have been working from home, a lot of ours have been teleworking like I have been, it's really going to be hard moving forward to say that that's an undue hardship and we can't allow that to continue. It doesn't mean we have to allow it to continue for everyone. Doesn't mean that we have to allow it to continue forever. But during this period when we've got continued COVID-19 exposure concerns, there are going to be certain employees with medical conditions that if they bring forth those medical conditions and their doctor says they should not be working, it's going to be really hard for an employer to say, well, I can't let them continue to telework during this time. If you have employees who have been on leave during this time and that's also leave is considered an accommodation under the ADA, so the same thing there. It's going to be hard to say, I can't let that person continue on leave. So if you offer work, there's no ADA issue involved with an employee coming back. You've taken all the safety issues that you need to and communicated with about them, and they full on refuse and are not going to come back. As I said, you don't have to pay them. You don't have to let them take PTO or vacation. A good employer who's engaging with employees and wants to bring a good employee back, these are things you may want to do, but there's no requirement, and especially if it's not a good situation with the employee. They may be eligible for mandatory sick leave, not in Alabama, not in Birmingham, but I know a lot of times we have employers who on these webinars who are in other states and other cities. And so, you know, be mindful, there could be a local rule that you've got to follow. They're not going to be qualified for the FFCRA leave. And we've had many, many webinars on FFCRA. You know, just to remind you, if you're an employer under 500, the FFCRA kicks in with additional paid sick leave and with some additional kind of what we've been calling FMLA plus leave for childcare. So those are paid leave options. They're not qualified for that. Just saying I don't want to work, I'm not comfortable working, that doesn't qualify them. So unless they meet one of the other 6 reasons for qualification, they have COVID-19, they're caring for someone with COVID-19, they have childcare issues due to COVID-19, all those reasons, then that wouldn't just automatically trigger. And they should be disqualified from unemployment if they refuse to come to work and work is available. I put a but there because, as you know, the Alabama Department of Labor is overloaded with unemployment claims, and particularly, the ones related to COVID-19. So many of them are just being coded COVID-19 and being granted, and employers have been good about helping employees get unemployment when needed during this time. But many employers are concerned what's going to happen when these employees don't want to come back to work because they're making so much now under unemployment benefits. So in Alabama, we've got unemployment weekly benefits are capped at, I think now $245 a week, $275, I can't remember. And now that we have the federal benefit, which is an additional $600 a week on top of that, so you've got up to $875 a week for unemployment benefits if a person qualifies, and depending on how much they work and how much they make. But for, there's a tipping point there for some employees where they may make more staying on unemployment than coming back to work. So employers are concerned about how to call those people back and if they will come back. The Alabama Department of Labor, there's a great resource out called Business Rights plus COVID-19 that's coming from Chamber of Commerce in the Dothan area, and the Alabama Department of Labor is part of that. And it talks about how to work through making sure that doesn't happen and the steps to take. You should be communicating with employees, in advance about the recall date. When calling them back, you should create a roster, and they've got some great resources there at the Alabama, the Department of Labor website for doing that. And then if they refuse to return to work, you inform Alabama Department of Labor in writing. Don't try to call them right now. That'll make you crazy. They will not answer your call. But you can upload it to their website, and that should take care of the issue, letting them decide the unemployment issue, but informing them that you have work available and have recalled employees. So hopefully that will help with that. Another big issue we're seeing in this area is childcare. Childcare is one of our systemic issues that people are only now figuring out, ready to recall employees, but there's not enough childcare options right now in Birmingham because many daycares continue to be closed. So what do I do when I've called an employee and they can't come back to work because they don't have any childcare? This is where we're, as employers, my best advice is to engage on that. I sit on the board of directors of a small nonprofit childcare center, and we're really struggling with how and when to reopen. We have a target date now for the Tuesday after Memorial Day. That is a target date, and we're working towards it because, again, we've got to have all the resources in place that'll let us reopen. We've got to figure out how to maintain the less than 12 kids in a room that are required under the Safer at Home order. We've had the mask ordinance in Birmingham that we've worked through now with the city of whether or not children in daycares have to be wearing masks and at what age. There's just a ton to work through, and these childcare centers operate on razor thin margins. So if they don't have, they're the type of employer where if they open back up and they don't have 100% enrollment, all the children are not back, it's very hard for them to operate on a third of their enrollment coming back or even a half of their enrollment coming back. A lot of these groups have tried to get PPP loans and were unable to, either in the first or second round. The group I work with very luckily got one in the second round, which is why we can do a reopening without being 100% enrollment. We wouldn't be able to afford to pay teachers if we didn't have everyone back without the PPP loans. So how as a business can you engage on that issue? Child care resources, Voices for Alabama Children, they're all working really hard in Alabama right now to try to make sure that child care centers are able to reopen. Engage with them, find out how you can help. Is there PPE that daycare centers need that your group can provide? Is there financial resources that you can allocate towards sponsorships to help them stay open or reopen? This is a systemic, bigger system problem, but Alabama is not going to be able to get back to work if people do not have the child care they need. And I will tell you right now that availability was already very, very hard to get into a quality child care center before this happens. And so now with so many not reopening, it's going to continue to be something that you're going to have to work with your employees on, and hopefully engage in the bigger system in Birmingham and Alabama on helping us solve that problem. So what if you offer work and they actually say, well, come back? That could happen. It should happen. I hope it's going to happen. What do you do next? For some people who have had a real break in service and they weren't just on a temporary layoff, I mean, maybe, reaching back out saying, hey, I'm rehiring employees now. I want you to come back. You're going to have to go through kind of your whole checklist of rehiring that you did before, which make sure you've got the time to do that and that you're keeping that in mind. For other employees, you're going to make sure that you've developed training, orientation for the new normal. So if they're coming back, you want to make sure they're going to be trained on all the systems that you're putting in place, all the policies that are going to be changing and procedures. And then keep an eye on things like, are they going to be eligible when they return for the paid sick leave? If you're an employer who provides FFCRA, again, a less than 500 employer, which is most of the folks probably on the phone, on Zoom, I should say. And then they're not going to have a waiting period for eligibility for EPSL. So you're going to have to make sure you've got that posted. Hopefully you've already communicated it with sending out the poster. If not, let's coordinate about that. Let me help you with that. And so then, in addition, your employees are going to be eligible for, and this is also any public employer, I should say, so a private employer under 500, and then any public employer. What about this Emergency Federal Medical Leave Act or this FMLA Plus? You might think when they first come back, they won't be eligible, but if they were eligible before and they were laid off or let go before December 31st, which we're in, and then you've called them back and they were eligible before they left, they've specifically carved in that into the law that they'll continue to be eligible. So you've got to be prepared. Make sure you have your FFCRA policies all in place. Again, your postings in place. You've thought through the payroll issues for that. I'm working with a lot of major big public employers who are having, to figure out payroll issues because they've got so many employees and they've got to provide this additional leave. So a lot to think of there. So as long as we're talking about leave, make sure this is going to be a time of lots of compliance with leave issues. Make sure you've got resources extra to address that. Again, if you're a multi-state or multi-city employer, make sure you're complying across the board with that in those areas. All right, so exposure for positive employees. This, as you're calling employees back, you've got to have in place your exposure control plans. And this could be an entire hour-long webinar. And in fact, it was. I did one. If you go to littler.com and pull up my bio, it'll link you to a recorded webinar on what to do when an employee tests positive for COVID-19. And so if you have not been dealing with that issue and it's completely new to you, please go to that and use that as a resource. But it's important to know when to send employees home, We've got to understand how to do contact tracing. The CDC website has got great resources for this as well. So what basically, if an employee is exhibiting symptoms, we send them out until they can no longer have those symptoms within 72 hours without any medication. We don't require them to get a COVID-19 test because they're not always available. As they become more available in our community, then it's helpful to send them for one or ask them to get one now that the availability has increased. We don't do contact tracing for symptoms. We only do that when we have a positive confirmation or either a test or confirmed by a doctor that based on their exposure and symptoms that it's believed to be COVID-19. That's when we find out who has been working around them in our workplace and who's had direct contact with them. So direct is close, within 6 feet. And then it needs to be continuous, so over a period of time, not just I walked past them in the hallway. Now, if somebody, when you're talking, this is something to keep in mind, you've got to keep confidentiality here. We do not release information or names of who has tested positive or is a confirmed positive case. We talk to that employee, find out who they have been around at work and who they've had this direct contact with. We self-isolate the employee. We send them home for 2 weeks, and then we also self-quarantine the employees they have been in direct contact with. So those employees go home for 2 weeks, and that's where that stops. It doesn't just keep continuing down the line. It's the employee and then the people they've been in the direct contact with. That's who we self-quarantine and send home. It's not then the people they've been in direct contact. That would just continue down the line. So we want to make sure we have increased our cleaning in the workplace, and that's going to include contacting the individuals who are doing that cleaning, make sure that we've got the resources there, we've got our cleaning crew knows they're going to be cleaning more, knows that we're going to want to increase disinfectant. We're going to want to institute policies where people in the workplace are wiping down doorknobs, wiping down work areas, wiping down common areas. That needs to be done throughout the day. And so there's just a lot of, and then office logistics, making sure there's a lot of employers who have done, you come in one way and then you leave the other way so that there's no passing in stairwells, no passing in common areas, marking off 6-foot distances, making sure people understand that meetings right now will continue to be virtual even if you're in the office. There's just a lot of making sure your desks are 6 feet apart or your work areas, so much logistically to think through. And then think through how you're going to respond to complaints. What if, I've heard Joe has COVID-19 and he's still here. How do you work through that? Who's going to respond to those? If you have an HR department, make sure they're engaged on this, dealing with these kind of perceived positives as opposed to a confirmed diagnosis. And then reporting to OSHA, we've got some new OSHA guidance that came out not too long ago, where OSHA recordable illnesses in the workplace, what OSHA is saying right now is if there is objective evidence that the COVID-19 case is work-related, then you would record it. So there's rarely going to be objective evidence, and so this takes some of the load off employers. But for example, if you've got a cluster of cases that have happened in your workplace where one person was positive, and even though you self-quarantined and sent people home that were in direct contact, if those people get sick, you can't just ignore the fact that they most likely got sick because they were working next to someone who had a positive diagnosis. So that would be something that should be OSHA recordable. And if the employee provides you reasonable information, that would lead you to the knowledge that they got it at work. And so you can't just ignore it, but it also is going to be harder to find the objective evidence to record it as an OSHA issue. And now it's different if you are a healthcare emergency response employer. Your OSHA recordable obligation is different there. So those things you want to have in place and have thought through. They need to be communicated to employees. You need to have a policy on it, and you've got to have that before your employees, come back to work. Maintaining a safe workplace is obviously of utmost importance, as we've been talking about. So you want to think about things like, do I want to require face coverings? If you're in the city of Birmingham right now, you must. And how are you going to do that? Are you going to provide the face coverings? You're going to let the employee wear their own? Donning and doffing, what that means is, do you have to pay the employee for the time it takes to put the mask on and off, or to, if you are providing the mask, you will have to pay the employee. If you are requiring them to wear the mask and they have to wait in line to pick up a mask from you, then you should include that in their compensable time. If they are allowed to take the mask home and launder it themselves, and they can wear it to and from work, then that is not going to start their compensable work day. So you've got to think through those issues. What about accommodating employees who can't wear masks? Some employees have medical conditions where they cannot wear a mask. They aren't able to breathe. We've had an issue I have had with an employer who they had a deaf employee and they couldn't communicate in the workplace when everyone was wearing masks. So they went to face shields. So these are all things that you've got to think through with regard to face coverings. Are you going to require them, or are you going to recommend them? What is your policy going to be if someone refuses to wear them? Screening workers. Are you going to take temperature checks or thermal imaging? Are you going to ask the questions that we've all asked if you've had to go to the bank recently about travel or about symptoms, and the questionnaires, and have your employees sign an attestation about that? Are you going to allow employees to check their temperature at home and report it when they get to work? If you're going to have a temperature check at work, you've got to consider privacy issues. If you record a temperature check, first, it's 100.4 is the cutoff. So anything under that, 103 and under that, you would not record. But if someone is 100.4 or higher, you would need to record that. And that would need to be done privately. And the record would need to be kept separately from a personnel file. It's a medical record. So you've got to make sure whoever's conducting the checks is trained to do it. They have to wear some type of protective clothing, so an apron that's got to be changed throughout the day. And so if you were doing those type of record checks, you've got to make sure that you have the policies in place and the training before you start conducting those. And the EOC has issued guidance saying that we are allowed to, as employers, to take tests, to test employees, even for COVID-19. They've got to be accurate and reliable, which is kind of the rub. We've got either diagnostic tests that would diagnose someone as having COVID-19, or we're now looking at that different antibody tests. Those are all still in development. We have some big employers who are thinking through how to use those and when, but it's not something that right now most employers are going to be able to utilize in any type of way that makes sense. If you think it through, you test everybody who comes to work. All you know is they don't have COVID on that day. It doesn't mean, or it hasn't showed up for to be tested on that day. It hasn't developed into something a test can detect. So it's a little hard to think through how testing is going to help employers. But I think we'll be seeing that more and more. I just wanted to, make sure, keep mindful that the information we're getting from the governor's office, from Dr. Harris, has been very helpful. They're obviously focused on this and helping us talk through the weather questions. And we've got to be concerned some about exposure. And particularly, one thing to know, workers' comp is not necessarily going to kick in for these COVID-19 diagnosis, because it's going to be very hard to establish again that it was exposure at work in which individuals have come down with COVID-19. Some states are trying to expand workers' comp, particularly for essential workers. We've already seen a lot of those efforts shut down by different industry groups, because it really would have opened up workers' comp to just an unbelievable amount, and employers are not going to be able to handle that type of exposure. So we haven't seen that in Alabama, but it could be coming up next. Safety is definitely going to be what we see as kind of the new issue for employers. And so that's just something I want you to keep in mind, that as we start seeing more and more kind of what people are focused on next, workplace safety complaints are going to be just a huge part of that. And I think we're going to see strikes about it. We're going to see a lot of organized efforts. And hopefully it'll be to a good end, but it's just something to know that safety's got to be at the front of every decision you're making right now. Jessica, I know we're running out of time. We got lots more to talk about, but I don't know if y'all wanted to, at this point, see if we've got any questions before we need to wrap up.
I think that'd be great. You know, we've got a chat function. If anyone wants to post a question or two, we might have time for literally 1 to 2 questions. And we also have a door prize that we want to be able to give out. So before we start taking questions, I don't see any yet. We're going to open up the chat room, but I will go ahead and get 2 random numbers from Fred McCallum so that we can draw for our door prizes. And Janell, maybe you can give us a quick heads up on what these are. I know it's a return to work toolkit.
Yeah, it's going to include just a guide that we put together, and then a policy that can be used. You can they're designed to you can change them up for your particular workforce, and then we've got some forms that will be helpful to use for some of these different things we've been talking about.
Perfect. And Fred, if you don't mind giving 2 random numbers between 1 and 80, and then we'll use those to pick from the people who've registered. All
right. And thanks, Janell, again, very much. That was really good. 2 numbers, 10 and 45.
Good deal. Okay, we are going to use those, and we're going to match them up with everybody. So we'll do that while we look through these questions. Let's see. The first question I have is that there's an employee that has no conditions, but states that a spouse and/or children do have pre-existing conditions. Employee is nervous about bringing something home from work. Anything that you could say in that kind of situation?
Yeah, and so that's going to really be more of are you able to accommodate that situation? We've seen with a lot of essential workers, they've had to almost kind of isolate themselves from family members, which is really hard. But that's had to occur for a lot of employees who have been continuing working. We have that situation here in my house. We have my mother-in-law lives with us, and she's in her late 70s, and so we're worried about that as well. But again, it's going to be talking through, are you able to accommodate that? And that's not going to be, the individual employee is not disabled. And so that's not going to be a situation where, you are trying to cover an issue under the ADA for that particular employee, but does it trigger any of the FFCRA leave, any of the emergency paid sick leave? If you've got to provide that, and then just, are you able, is that employee able to telework? Are you able to show that employee that all the safety, they're going to come in and you're going to make sure that they're not exposed in the workplace. And so by providing them with a mask, making sure everyone's wearing masks, making sure everything's wiped down, making sure that they're never within 6 feet of someone, will that make them comfortable enough to know that there's not an exposure issue there for them to be able to work? And if not, are you able to accommodate that issue or not? And so that's going to be just really a back and forth communication. And sometimes employees are very hesitant, and then when they come into the workplace and can see what you've done to make sure they're safe, they feel a whole lot better about the exposure.
That's great. We've got several others here. We'll take one more. What about, are arbitration agreements for returning workers advisable or enforceable?
That's a good question, and I'll be honest, I haven't thought through that, so this is going to be just off the top of my head. If you have an arbitration agreement in place, then obviously, you've already have it in place. You can, have an employee, as you're returning employees to work, make that change and decide to implement an arbitration agreement in exchange for return to work. Excuse me, would be the bargain for that. But the question will be, what it's going to cover and why it is that you feel like you need it at this time. We don't know right now what type of exposure issues we're going to be seeing with regard to litigation. And so we probably will have a lot of employment litigation, and we don't know yet if courts will say if that's an enforceable arbitration agreement or not. Currently, I would say it would be under the way courts have interpreted hiring an employee and making their employment, that's you're hiring them, and so they agree to arbitration as part of that hiring process. But we don't know if there may be some carve out for this in the future. So it's really be helpful to talk through that with your employment lawyer. I don't know that it's going to be enforceable just to carve out COVID-19. And so if it's just, this is the time we're bringing back employees and it's the time we've been wanting to implement this arbitration agreement, can we do it now? I think that's more likely is going to be an enforceable agreement.
That's great. Well, I know we have several other questions here, and we will try to get answers to those on that COVID-19 resource page that the BBA has, along with the slides that we mentioned earlier. I just want to go ahead and thank everybody for joining us. Thank you, Janell, for all the good content. I know there's a lot more to be covered, so make sure to go to that resource page and look through the slides. And then it might be worth reaching out to Janell to see about any specific situations that you guys have that she could help with. Fred, thank you again as well for all the guidance that you've given us. It's tricky times for everybody, so it does help to have a lot of the resources that the BBA is giving. I think people are appreciating that more than ever before.
Thanks, Jessica. Really appreciate it. Appreciate everybody being on. Appreciate all of your support of the BBA. Thank you.
Thank you. And real quick, just the two winners. You'll be hearing from Janell, but that's Peggy Chowing from McLean Science Center and Raquel Melton from Plastic Pack Packaging. So congrats, and you'll be getting some info from Janell on your packages. So thanks again, everybody. Good luck as y'all make
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.